Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 8 about civil liberties. It's Lesson 2 about fundamental freedoms. In this lesson, you'll learn about civil liberties, you'll learn about the 10th Amendment, you'll learn about the 9th Amendment, you'll learn about unenumerated rights, and you'll learn about the purpose of the Bill of Rights. Rights, which we discussed in the previous lesson, can also be called civil liberties. When we call them civil liberties, we're referring to them as our fundamental freedoms that we have in society. An example can be seen in the background photo here. We have people praying on the steps of the United States Supreme Court building. This represents one of the fundamental freedoms that we have as an American people. The right to practice our religion as we see fit. This is one of our civil liberties. So when we discuss the subject of civil liberties, which is the topic for this entire unit of the course, what we're really talking about is what liberties we have, what freedoms we have, what rights we have. So civil liberties is about what freedoms, liberties, rights, whatever you want to call them, we possess. Civil liberties are not the same as civil rights. Civil rights will be the subject of the next unit of this course. If civil liberties are about what freedoms we have, civil rights is then about who gets those freedoms, who gets those liberties, who gets those rights, however you want to describe them. So civil liberties is about what your freedoms are. Civil rights is about who gets those freedoms. So the next unit of the course will be about civil rights. This unit is about civil liberties. I wanted to take time to explain that because it can get confusing, because the first lesson in this unit we talked about rights, because that's how people commonly refer to these concepts. People don't go around talking about their civil liberties in everyday conversation, but they may talk about their rights. Essentially, it's the same thing. But it can get confusing because then this term civil rights comes up, and people begin to think, oh, that must be talking about these rights that I have. Well, no, not exactly. When we talk about what rights you have, we're talking about civil liberties. When we talk about who gets those, then we're talking about civil rights. Well, if we're on the topic of civil liberties, how can we know what they are? How can we know what freedoms we have, what rights we have? Well, if you ask a person, just in random America, say, hey, tell me where I can find out what our rights are. What are they going to tell you? They will probably say, go look at the Bill of Rights. And they would say that because the Bill of Rights is a list of rights, which you learned in the first lesson really means it's a list of powers that were not granted to the national government. Remember, we have this traditional American view of negative rights. A right is something that is not under government control. So the Bill of Rights is a list of things that the government is not allowed to control. The Bill of Rights consists of the first 10 amendments that were added to the Constitution. And what we're going to do is spend the next several lessons going through the Bill of Rights in detail, seeing what powers were denied to the national government and why they were denied. We're going to begin that perusal of the Bill of Rights by maybe kind of surprisingly going to the end of the list. Remember, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And we're going to look at Amendment 10 first. We've actually seen Amendment 10 previously in this course when we had the unit on federalism. And in that unit on federalism, we talked about how the 10th Amendment preserves the initial balance of power between the national government, the states, and the people. Remember what it says. It says any powers that aren't given to the national government are reserved or kept by either the states or the people. Okay, this is a concept we've talked about before. Powers not delegated to the national government belong to somebody else. But we want to talk about it now in the in the context of rights that we've been talking about. Remember, a right is something you have control over and the government doesn't have control over. In the previous lesson, we talked about two sides of a coin, where we have a single coin on a particular topic, and depending on how you look at that coin, we could either call it a right or a power. Now, which it's going to be, a right or a power, depends on who has it. If the government has control of that thing, we're going to call it a power. But if the individual has control of it, we're going to have a right. We're going to call it a right. But the 10th Amendment, which we misread, actually makes this a little more complicated, because it says that any powers that weren't delegated to the national government are either retained by the people, in this case, in which we call it a right, or they're retained by the states. We actually have a third player in this. We need to add a third piggy bank. So, in the United States of America, if we're going to look at how our government's actually set up for this evaluation of rights that we're doing in this unit, this evaluation, another term for it is civil liberties, is we have to consider that power over things could reside one of three different places. It can either reside with the national government, in which case the states don't control it, or the individual, or it can reside in the states, in which case the national government doesn't control it, neither do individuals, or it can reside in the individual. Then the individual controls this thing, and neither the national government nor the states control it. Now, just saying who control it doesn't necessarily mean that the others don't have some sort of say over it. So let's go back to the example that I used in the previous lesson where I talked about parking a car. Well, where does that coin sit? Somebody has power to decide where you can or can't park a car on a city street. Well, since the city street is probably not going to be the national government deciding, but then again, there's a sign up there saying where you can or can't park. So in a way, it's really not the individual deciding. It's the state government that possesses that coin. So they're the ones deciding when people can or cannot park there. But that still doesn't take other people out of the decision. For example, an individual still gets to choose whether to park their car there during the times that they are allowed to park it there. They're still participating in this process. But ultimately, who controls it, who's really deciding in the end whether a car can be there or not, it's the state government that's doing so. Now, remember, I taught this in the previous lesson. A coin, which represents a right or a power, can only be in one of these piggy banks at a time. If the state has it, it is not in the individual or the national. If the national has it, it's not in the state or the individual. If the individual has it, it's not in the state or the national. It can only be one place at a time. Only one party controls it. And it's only if individuals control it that we can call it a right. Now, as we continue going through the Bill of Rights, I'm going to move up from the 10th Amendment now to the 9th. Now, I'm taking care of these two amendments that appear at the end for a reason, because they discuss some broad general principles that are applicable, while the other amendments are more specific, and we'll get to them in future lessons. What the 9th Amendment says is the enumeration of certain rights. In other words, what that word enumeration means, literally, is to number things, but what it means in more common use is to list. So what it's really saying here is the listing of certain rights in the Constitution. Well, where are certain rights listed in the Constitution? Remember, this is the 9th Amendment. It's talking about the first 8 amendments that came before it. So the listing of certain rights in the Constitution, elsewhere in the Bill of Rights, shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights that are retained by the people. Now, carefully think about what that means. Okay, just the mere fact that we listed rights one place should not be taken by you to mean that you don't have other rights that were not listed anywhere. But just because they weren't listed, that should not mean that you don't have them. You do have them. So, we have rights that are not listed in the Bill of Rights. But wait a minute. If we have rights that aren't listed, how are we going to know what they are? If not all rights were listed in the Bill of Rights, then how did they decide which ones they were going to list and leave other ones out? And why did they choose those? Because now, I mean, we're just going to have arguments about what the other ones are since they weren't written down anywhere. Maybe you think you have a right to do whatever you want, and I would disagree. Or you'd disagree with what I have or think I have a right to. It's going to be a big argument. But if it's written down somewhere, that at least helps. So the people who wrote the Bill of Rights had to make choices. They had to say, okay, we can't include everything here. So we're going to have to pick some to include and not others. Now, we're going to have this catch-all at the end, this Ninth Amendment, that lets people know that, hey, you do have other rights we didn't bother to write down. But they did choose to write down some of them. Those must be particularly important for some reason. But what is the reason? To figure that out, we need to go back to the events that led to the inclusion of the Bill of Rights. Remember, the Constitution had been sent out to be ratified by the states. And there were some people who opposed it. For example, Patrick Henry. We mentioned him earlier in the course. He was one of the great patriots of the time of the American Revolution. And he said, hey, my big objection to this government that's being created under the Constitution is it doesn't leave us any way of defending our rights. We can't stand up to the government and stop it from treating us tyrannically if we actually allow this new government to be created under the Constitution. Well, this was a common concern among people who opposed the Constitution when it was sent out to be ratified. And we called those people collectively the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, to alleviate this concern, demanded that a Bill of Rights be attached to the Constitution. So remember, if their big worry is that this new government that's being created will be too powerful and it'll end up being act tyrannical and oppressive toward us, and then they ask for a Bill of Rights to be included, obviously they're thinking that the Bill of Rights is going to be a way to stop the national government from abusing its power. It's going to be a way to stop tyranny from happening. So what that tells us then is that those things that were included in the Bill of Rights must be the rights that were deemed by the founders to be most important to check and control the national government and prevent it from abusing its power. So in the next couple of lessons, as we go through the first 8 amendments to the Constitution, we're going to keep that in mind as we look at those amendments and try to figure out what they mean. The intent behind them all was to check the national government, to keep its powers under control, and to make sure that it would not abuse them and treat us all tyrannically. Now, let's review what we learned in this lesson. What are civil liberties? Do they deal with racial equality or fundamental freedoms? Or are they rules for lawsuits? Or are they rights that don't hurt other people? Civil liberties are our fundamental freedoms, what we call rights, whether they hurt other people or not. What does the 10th Amendment do? Does it protect freedom of speech? Does it recognize unenumerated rights? Does it list unenumerated rights? Or does it acknowledge retained powers? The 10th Amendment acknowledges retained powers. In other words, it says, hey, any powers not given to the national government are retained either by the states or by the people. What does the 9th Amendment do? Does it protect freedom of speech? Does it recognize unenumerated rights? Does it list enumerated powers? Or does it acknowledge retained powers? The 9th Amendment recognizes unenumerated rights. It tells us, hey, just because a right wasn't written down in the Bill of Rights doesn't mean you don't have it. Now, that's still kind of difficult, though, trying to figure out what these rights are if they were never written down. We're going to have arguments about it. But it tells you that you do have other rights. Well, what are unenumerated rights? Are they natural rights, civil rights, listed rights, or rights that are not listed? Unenumerated rights are rights that were never listed in the Constitution. Again, just the fact that they weren't written down doesn't mean you don't have them, but it's tough to figure out what they are. And what is the purpose of the Bill of Rights? Is it to prevent tyranny? Is it to enable judicial power? Is it to emphasize responsibility? Or is it to create government powers? The purpose of the Bill of Rights is to prevent tyranny. And we point that out so that we can recognize that as the purpose behind each of the individual amendments. And as we read those amendments, we can then look to see how they're stopping the national government from becoming too powerful, oppressive, and tyrannical. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 8. It'll be Lesson 3, and it'll be the Bill of Rights, Part 1.